Space Marine 2 is right around the corner. Even though a part of me is skeptical, I'm still very excited for it. And so I want to talk about why the first game was such a great third-person shooter, and why it was so captivating and underrated. As someone who's never delved into Warhammer 40k due to being broke, but loving shooter games, this game is pretty great. It's really odd that this game isn't backwards compatible on the new Xbox consoles, which is weird considering there's quite a bit of hype for the second game, which would obviously mean there's going to be people wanting to play the first installment. One thing I really like about this game is that it takes a lot of aspects from games like God of War, the original trilogy of course, and the Gears of War trilogy, and it kind of blends the two, and that's because some of the development team were composed of, guess what, people who had worked on Gears of War games and the God of War trilogy. They even had people who had worked on the first two Far Cry games, you know, when Far Cry was actually good, and when they didn't rehash Far Cry 3 for a decade, because Ubisoft are creatively bankrupt, and the people developing the new sequel are a completely new studio. In Space Marine, you play as Captain Titus with Leandros and also Sardonis. It's a pretty good squad. So in the game, you shoot a lot, and you also slash a lot, and you also dodge a lot. At some points, the gameplay can be pretty hectic, especially with the orcs. But it also feels a little bit more different than other shooters because you're a Space Marine. You can feel a bit of heaviness that comes from playing as one, such as the noise that comes from running. I played the game on hard mode, and personally it was the first time in a long while a shooter game challenged me. And this is coming from someone who plays shooter games religiously, and that's because I had to learn multiple mechanics such as having to melee and dodging. I used the dodge mechanic a lot, and I even still struggled by the time I got to the final mission. And whenever I died, it kinda did feel like my fault. The guns in this game are really fun, and they feel pretty heavy with the sound effects. They do what they're supposed to do. You gain access to more weapons as you progress, but can only carry a few. And so sometimes you may come across a gun, but you have to decide whether to pick it up or not. Because it may be more powerful, but since it's a power weapon, it's probably going to have less ammunition. For example, I use the Stalker Bolter over the laser cannon, or the las cannon, despite the las cannon being more powerful, because the Stalker Bolter had more ammunition. I actually think I use the Stalker Bolter the most, but my other favorites would be the Melter Gun and I think the Storm Bolter. The Storm Bolter is pretty damn vicious. There's also the Vengeance Launcher, which is quite fun. The Vengeance Launcher is a grenade launcher that shoots sticky grenades that are remotely detonated. What I do is just shoot a bunch of them and then I detonate it. You also do get grenades, which are pretty useful. You can even get a jetpack where you can fly around and crush enemies with a Thunder Hammer. As you progress, some weapons are upgraded and become more powerful. Most of the gameplay from my perspective is shooting orcs running at you while also another type of enemy shoots you. The enemy shooting you being more range oriented, while also dodging enemies that are about to slash you. And doing executions whenever you can to gain health. As you progress through the game more, new varieties of enemies are introduced. It isn't anything groundbreaking, but it's pretty damn fun. Especially with the characteristics of Warhammer 40k. I think this game has decent enemy variety like the orcs and demons. I didn't really expect the demons to be dashing around, but my favorite part about them is just blasting them with the melter gun. And you also have to find ways to not get hoarded with enemies, while also dodging. I can really only think of two shooters that have a dodge mechanic, this and Gears of War, but there's more melee oriented enemies in this game, so you're definitely going to be evading more in Space Marine than in Gears of War of course. There's also executions, which is a pretty great mechanic. Its executions visually are kinda similar to the original God of War games, but how it functions, it more reminds me of Doom Eternal, even though Doom Eternal came out nearly a decade later than this game, and that's because executions are pretty vital to the gameplay, as it regenerates your health when you do an execution. Doom Eternal also does this, but I actually think it's a little bit more interesting in Space Marine, since in Doom Eternal it can be used as sort of a get out of jail free card, because you're invincible when doing an execution, while in Space Marine you aren't invincible while performing an execution, and can still die performing one. So you have to find a good timing to perform one, while also keeping the possibility of dying, since unlike Doom Eternal, you have less ways to escape, and most enemies are coming in hordes. One weird thing about this game is that in some sections, mostly this turret one near the end of the game, you're going to need to take cover without actually taking cover since there's no cover mechanic. It actually works perfectly fine. In fact, you must do this in sections when there's a Chaos Marine and other large proportions of enemies. But at the same time, it kind of feels awkward. I can't really tell if it's a game design choice, since there's a promotion when this game came out with cover is for the weak, but at the same time, some of the missions, you basically have to take cover. Especially with the sections when the only enemies are turrets. Turrets that can blast you to oblivion. It's kinda weird, and it's not like Space Marines are foreign to cover. They're warriors at war. Even if they're genetically bigger than regular guardsmen, they still have to take cover. I think it's because the developers wanted to differentiate themselves from other cover shooters at the time, like Gears of War, which the third Gears of War game released pretty close to Space Marine 1. And so they probably didn't want people to call Space Marine 1 a Gears of War clone, which it was still called a Gears of War clone by a lot of people, even though it's much more different. There's also the Fury ability, which grants stronger melee attacks and increased health regen till it runs out. I utilize this mostly when I would get overwhelmed by enemies, and can also be upgraded later on. The duration of the ability is increased once upgraded. It's pretty fun, but you're also not invincible, so you still have to be careful. I definitely didn't use the melee mechanic as much as other people did, and it's because sometimes it felt a little bit awkward. Occasions where I'd be trying to melee an enemy, but instead of the melee following the camera, like how shooting is, it's actually following your movement input, which took me quite a bit to get used to. But I can see it functioning well on controller. Sometimes I felt like meleeing in a mob full of orcs was kind of a death sentence, and I kinda learned that quick. Surprisingly, there's also some destructive environments in this game, which is cool. Visually, this game is great, because I think it is using some art style in a way, but I can't really point it out. With the story elements, I sometimes wish there were a little bit more dialogue about stuff in battles when you're with Leandros and Sidonis. But at the same time, I kinda like the silence when Titus is just by himself. Since there are a lot of games where the protagonist must make quips about literally everything, which is essentially the Nathan Drake effect, since a lot of protagonists after Uncharted had a protagonist like this. And it's not even just games, it's happening in movies too. I watched Furiosa and I was kinda enthralled because it was the first time in a long time where the main character in a 2 hour and 30-minute film had only like 30 lines in the whole movie, where every other one has about like 200. And here Titus only talks when he really needs to. The game has a decent story and is pretty fun. The characters are great, although the story can feel a little bit too predictable. Let's just say at a certain point the story has a twist, and I expected it early on. There are boss fights in this game, which one of them is with the antagonist Grimskull. This boss fight was actually pretty fun. I thought it was like an appetizer to the final boss, but then the final boss was a little bit underwhelming, because I thought the final boss was going to be like an actual fight, a boss fight like Grimskull, but it was more of an interactive cutscene, unfortunately, especially it being the conclusion to the game. Overall, I really recommend Space Marine 1's campaign, especially if you really enjoyed third-person shooters and are looking forward to the sequel, which hopefully is good. Space Marine 1 feels like it takes a lot from other games and puts it into one, which makes it feel a bit unique and its own thing. If Saber Interactive uses the same formula as the first game, I think it can be a really successful game. I'd give the first game around an 8 out of 10, and this is only covering the campaign, as the multiplayer has fallen off, which you should expect for a 13-year-old game, so you can't really find any matches. So yeah, it's been Trojan, and I'll see you in the next one.